Welcome to the debate. Today, we're chatting about blasphemy laws. Chill but punchy. The big fight here, looking at Indonesia's specific law, Pasal 156A, but also its global equivalents, is really how we balance protecting a community's foundational identity, what some people call the sacred, against, every individual's right to speak their mind.
Right, that tension is definitely real, but I think the way we actually codify it legally, that's where the problems start.
For me, the central question is whether the core purpose of these laws, which is supposed to be keeping social stability and stopping, mob violence, actually works. Or if they just end up being weapons for political repression, maybe targeting minorities, and sometimes even economic coercion. So I'm taking the side that while abuse is awful, and it happens, the law's underlying rationale, especially the way Indonesia's Constitutional Court sees it, is a kind of necessary legal safety valve. It's needed to prevent outright vigilantism in really complex, plural societies.
Okay, and I'm going to push back pretty hard on that whole safety valve idea. I think the empirical evidence, honestly, is overwhelming that these laws are actually catalysts for violence and discrimination, not preventative measures at all. They really need to be scrapped entirely and replaced with super precise hate speech laws that actually protect people, not abstract ideas, and meet clear international standards.
Yeah, I see why you think that. I do. But let me give you maybe a different perspective here. We kind of have to look at this sociologically, right? In societies where religion isn't just a private belief, but it's like the literal foundation of collective identity, think about Pancasilah's first sila in Indonesia, belief in one God. It's right there in the Constitution. An attack on the secret isn't just seen as critique. It's viewed as an attack on the fundamental nature of society itself.
Okay, I get that cultural context, but why does that justify using what seems like a really flawed law?
Because the Constitutional Court, the MK as we call it, they knew this when they ruled back in 2009. They specifically argued that if you completely remove that law, you create this dangerous vacuum of law. Their logic was, look, if public religious anger is already there, and it often is, and you take away the legal route for the state to manage it, that anger won't just, disappear. It's likely to explode into anarchy and vigilantism. So they framed the law as ultimum remedium, a last resort intended purely to manage that inevitable social friction and protect public order. It's meant to be the firewall, basically.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the law acts as a firewall. Let me tell you why. The whole idea that this law prevents violence is, historically flawed. This foundational 1965 presidential decree, it's basically just an old colonial tool designed for control that got repurposed. And critically, it's systematically abused because the wording is just so vague, penodaan or insult.
What's specifically wrong with the wording, in your view?
Well, it fails the basic international human rights standard, the three-part test, mainly because insulting a religion is inherently subjective. It's just too broad. But look, don't just take my word for it. Look at the data compiled by groups like the Indonesian Legal Aid Foundation, YLBHI. They found that in over 60% of the cases they tracked, the police explicitly stated that they initiated the legal process after the fact, specifically to prevent vigilante justice. That proves the law is reactive to mob pressure, not preventative. It's essentially an instrument that empowers the majority to dictate when and who the state prosecutes. And that creates this massive chilling effect on minorities, on academics, on anyone expressing a different view.
Okay, but hold on. If the anger is already present, which you seem to acknowledge, how is the state supposed to step in? If you have genuine historical community tension, how can you claim that giving the state legal authority to prosecute the offense itself causes the violence? The legal process, even if it's flawed, arguably provides necessary friction. It slows down that rush to immediate street violence. The state steps in and says, okay, we have this. Stand down.
That's a compelling argument, I admit, because theoretically it sounds logical. But have you considered how the law, in reality, doesn't just manage the anger, it often ends up ratifying the mob's anger? The Meiliana case in North Sumatra is, for me, the ultimate paradox of this.
Yeah, maybe remind everyone of the basics of that case. It's quite well known, but the details matter.
Sure. So, Meiliana, who is Buddhist, was complaining, privately, mind you, just to a neighbor, about the local mosque speaker volume being too loud. Her private comment got twisted, distorted, and spread as a public rumor that she was banning the call to prayer, the azan. What happened next? Massive extra-legal violence. Mobs went out and burned, I think it was 11 Buddhist temples and cultural centers, viharas and kelentangs in Tanjung Balai. The law did nothing to prevent that destruction. The police were overwhelmed or absent. So what did the law do afterward?
It followed the violence, essentially.
Exactly. The court then turned around and punished her, the actual victim of the rumor mongering and the ensuing violence, with 1.5 years in jail using this very blasphemy law. So the law didn't stop the violence. It simply legitimized the mob's objective by punishing their target. It basically confirmed the mob's narrative. See, she was guilty, and the state agrees with us.
Okay, I absolutely agree the judicial outcome in Meiliana's case was deeply unjust. Horrific. That points to a severe abuse of the law by the judicial system. No question. But does abuse, even terrible abuse like that, necessarily mean we should scrap the entire legal framework that was, at least in theory, designed to maintain social order? Maybe we could argue for much stricter mens rea. That is the legal term for proving malicious intent. Maybe that's the fix rather than immediate abolition. If we could somehow ensure they only prosecute cases where there's genuine proof of intent to insult or incite hatred, maybe the law could be salvaged.
I don't think you can fix the concept just with stricter rules, because the problem is the concept itself. The law inherently attracts abuse, and we can't just ignore the extreme results in places that share this kind of legal DNA, like Pakistan. Even though their penalty is much harsher, a mandatory death penalty in some cases, Human Rights Watch found that in Pakistan, these accusations are routinely used for, blackmail and profit. They specifically cite examples of accusations being leveraged just to grab the land of poor minority communities.
That is genuinely systematic economic predation, then.
It totally is. It turns a law supposedly about piety into a tool for personal gain, for profit. And even if Indonesia's maximum penalty is lighter, 5 years, the systematic mechanism of abuse, I argue, remains the same. It often operates via what I tend to call the Fatwa-to-Law pipeline.
That's an interesting phrase. Could you break down that pipeline concept for the listeners?
Sure, the pipeline idea means that the persecution often doesn't start with the state itself. It starts when non-state religious bodies, maybe like the Indonesian Ulama Council, MUI, issue a fatwa, a religious opinion, declaring a minority group, say the Ahmadiyya community or others, as sesat, which means deviant or heretical. This non-state declaration then effectively legitimizes social violence and discrimination against them. Then, often after pressure or incidents, the state steps in and uses Pasal 156A to legally prosecute that already victimized minority. It's almost like the state outsources the initial legitimization of violence and only steps in afterward to, finish the job legally. It becomes a tool of systemic discrimination.
Right. I think I agree that the fatwa pipeline illustrates the state prioritizing a certain collective moral consensus over individual rights and practice. It definitely shows the law functioning as a powerful instrument of social control, reflecting those societal priorities. And, we can't ignore its political utility either. The Ahok case, the former governor of Jakarta, really proved that a legal charge like this can be leveraged as a massive political catalyst.
You're talking about the Oxy 212 movement?
Exactly. The charge against him mobilized these huge, coordinated demonstrations, Oxy 212, and arguably directly helped secure an electoral victory against a political opponent. So yes, it weaponizes faithful political gain. But crucially, the legal system then sort of manages the subsequent political fallout. The law provides the structure to channel that street anger into a court case, managing the transition or outcome of political power.
But shouldn't the legal system be a shield for rights, not a weapon for political campaigns? If the law is primarily used as a political tool, surely it shouldn't exist. Now let's maybe touch on global standards. I know you brought up the ECHR case, Otto Preminger v. Austria. It gets used a lot by countries that want to keep blasphemy laws because, yes, the European Court of Human Rights allowed Austria to seize a movie they deemed offensive to Catholicism, citing the need to preserve religious peace.
Right. And my point there is, if even the ECHR accepts this margin of appreciation, basically allowing states some leeway based on their specific cultural context, Shouldn't Indonesia, which is explicitly not a secular state, a very plural state, also be allowed to prioritize collective religious feelings to some degree?
I guess I come at it from a different way. That specific ECHR ruling, it's widely criticized by human rights experts globally. Many argue there is simply no human right not to be offended. An international law, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, is actually quite clear and consistent on this. It makes a really firm distinction.
Which particular articles are you referring to there?
Article 20. That protects people from incitement to violence, racism, or hatred. That's a legitimate restriction on speech, absolutely. But Article 19 protects freedom of expression, which includes the right to criticize ideas or symbols. We really shouldn't confuse those two. We charge someone for inciting violence against a person or a group, not for merely making an idea unpopular or offensive. And the inherent vagueness of insulting a religion makes the entire legal concept fundamentally incompatible with modern human rights standards, regardless of that one frankly shaky ECHR ruling from decades ago.
Okay, I follow the logic that you must protect the person, not necessarily the belief itself, from criticism. So, what's your concrete alternative path forward then? If not this law, then what?
Well, like I said, we don't actually need blasphemy laws at all. We need to shift the legal focus entirely. We move from protecting abstract ideas to protecting people from incitement to violence. That means precise, carefully drafted hate speech laws. And we have clear international precedents for this. Countries like Ireland, which abolished its blasphemy law via referendum in 2018, and Canada, also around 2018, they did this without descending into social chaos.
That's an important point, the lack of chaos afterwards.
Exactly. It shows it's possible. If Indonesia shifted to a rigorous hate speech model, think about the Meiliana case again. It would likely be reversed. The provocateurs who spread the rumor and incited the burning of the temples, they would be charged with inciting violence and hatred. Meiliana, meanwhile, would be protected from prosecution. That, to me, is what a functioning, rights-respecting legal system should look like.
The challenge, though, is that Indonesia politically and socially seems to be signaling it is absolutely not ready for that kind of jump. In fact, if you look at the new criminal code, the KUHP, which was finalized in 2023, the state chose to go in the exact opposite direction, didn't they?
And that's possibly the most worrying evidence of all, really. The new KUHP didn't just maintain the concept, it actively expanded it into multiple new articles, actually broadening the scope of what could be considered blasphemy or related offenses.
How exactly did they expand it? What's new?
Well, for instance, it now criminalizes not only defamation of religion, but also explicitly persuading someone to be a non-believer or to leave a religion. This isn't really about managing social friction anymore. This looks much more like a legislative regression. It seems committed to controlling ideology and public discourse about faith. It explicitly makes discussing conversion or apostasy a potentially dangerous topic in public. It really shows the state prioritizing control over citizens' spiritual existence above basic free expression.
I think that expansion, while I agree it's deeply problematic for civil liberties, it almost confirms my original thesis in a way. It shows that the state feels a profound political and cultural necessity to control discourse surrounding faith. They do it to preempt what they still seem to fear will be uncontrolled societal breakdown if they simply let go. It looks like a pragmatic, perhaps, albeit repressive, response to a deeply held collective sentiment or anxiety.
And that fear, which I argue is fueled by a law that actively causes the chaos it purports to prevent, is precisely what makes the law ineffective for stability and fundamentally dangerous to the rights of minorities and freethinkers.
Okay, we certainly agree on the high level of abuse and the definite chilling effect these laws have. But my position, I think, remains that the state intervention, however flawed it is in practice, is probably rooted in what they perceive as a valid, culturally specific need to manage that collective sentiment in a very pluralistic society. The fact that the state chose expansion over abolition in the new KUHP signals, I think, the depth of this political reality, whether we like it or not.
Right. And my conclusion is that we face a clear choice here. Pilihan A, let's call it, symbolic protection, which leads to repression, or Pilihan B, prescriptive protection focused on rights. The empirical data for me proves that Pilihan A The current status quo that Indonesia seems to be cementing is just not a functional solution for stability. It is, however, an effective mechanism for discrimination and political repression. So we have to keep pushing for the alternative, the precise, internationally compliant hate speech model that protects people, not abstract symbols.
All right, that's a wrap. This is The Debate, Light Insights, Fun Convos. Bye-bye.